Okay. And then, oh. So that's what we ended up with last week or 2 weeks ago. So we started with explaining organization culture and how organization culture affects innovation and the other way around. So we discussed several dimensions of organizational culture. That's what we did. So I ended with culture of the organization, and that's where we start today. So the culture of an organization is, well, if you look at the definition of structure, that was basically all the formal stuff that defines an organization. So all the rules, the ways of structuring an organization that is explained in more or less formal rules and procedures, and together it makes up the structure of an organization. Well, if that is the structure of an organization, the culture of an organization is everything that also defines an organization that you just cannot put into words directly. So it's about a basic understanding of how an organization functions, about the norms and values of an organization. And oftentimes, again, it's difficult to exactly define what an organization culture is. But there are several definitions, of course. So SHINE is one of the most well-known definitions. It's the deeper level of basic assumptions that are shared by the members of an organization that operate unconsciously and define in a basic taken for granted fashion an organization's view of itself environment. Well, that basically means, let's first of the other ones. Hofstede says, Hofstede is, of course, the most famous scientist who investigated national but also organization culture. So he started out by explaining differences between organizations in different countries. So he says that culture is a collective programming of the mind. And if you look at all these definitions, it's all about, okay, there's something unconscious, there's some kind of an automatic process that people know what the culture of an organization is. And it's basically a set of basic assumptions. So it's not something physical. It's something that we collectively think most of the time unconsciously. So the definition in pink is probably the best definition, I'd say, which I made from lots of other definitions from organization culture. And it says, okay, besides its structure and formal definitions, is a shared mental model that the members of an organization have in terms of values, beliefs, norms, practices, and artifacts. And I'll explain those. So it's a shared mental model that all people of an organization share. So why is organization culture important? So it's something intangible, it's a bit vague, but it turns out that an organization culture is much more important, or much more important, is also pretty important to understand an organization. Because, well, if you are in a group of friends, so if you have different groups of friends, you know that the way those different groups of friends behave is different. So every group of friends has its own set of norms that tell you how to behave. So in every WhatsApp group, there's a way of introducing a new topic. There's a way of saying goodbye if you leave a conversation. And those are aspects of culture, and organizations have these too. So why are these important? Well, they're important for an organization to keep control. It sounds weird that something so intangible can be used to have kind of control, kind of a structure, provide structure in an organization. But culture is commonly seen of one of three ways as an organization to have control over your employees. Not control in terms of telling them what to do, but a way of structuring what your employees do. So the first one, so there are generally three control strategies. So the first one is market-based. So that's that basically means that you that your employees do their work because it's a kind of supply and demand way of working. And this is what happens with flex workers. So if you look at people who deliver the mail from PostNL, people who work for Uber, for Uber Eats, that's really a market-based way of employing people. So because they get paid based on supply and demand. So if there's a lot of supply, they get paid more. And so basically they get paid for the work they do, for every package they deliver, they get paid. So that's one way of seeing an organization. The second way of structuring what your people are doing in an organization is just bureaucracy. That's structure based on formal coordination, rules and procedures. That's also a way of making people do what you want them to do as an organization. But the third way of exerting control is clan-based. And that's control based on shared values and belief. That's having the people in your organization believe in the goals of the organization and identifying with the organization. And in that way, they will do the work themselves without formal control, well, of course you have to pay them, but pay is then less important than the feeling of being part of the organization. So basically, these are three ways of getting the people in your organization so far as to do the work. So financial incentives, formal control structures, and culture. So culture is important because it's a sense of identification, it's a sense of autonomy as an organization, and a sense of feeling part of the organization. So why is that important? So what exactly does organization culture consist of? Well, it consists of beliefs and values and practice norms and artifacts. So beliefs and values are those things that are really the core of the organization. It's really the identity of an organization. And that's mostly unconscious. So we know what an organization, so you know what an organization is, you know the norms and values of the organization, but you not necessarily remember how you learned that. It's just learning by doing, seeing others behaving. And then there are things that are more or less observable in organizations, the practices, norms, and artifacts of how we do things. So think posters on the wall of an organization. Think how an organization is structured, how an organization may be structured physically. So is the manager approachable, or is he located in a separate office with a secretary in front of him, and is he not approachable at all? Things like manuals, etc. Employee manuals are also part of practices, norms, and artifacts that can be learned. I used to work for Hewlett Packard for a while, not long. So I did research for their customer care center when it was still located in Amsterdam. There in Hewlett Packard, they have very strong identification with Hewlett Packard. They have a way, they call it the HP way, which is the way they work. So it's kind of a definition of an organization culture. And when you start working at Hewlett Packard, you have training sessions in how Hewlett Packard functions. So you get a booklet called the HP way. It's written by the owners of HP, in which they explain how they feel HP should function and how they feel you should function as an employee within HP. And then you get training and all kinds of community building exercises with your colleagues. And you have that for a couple of days. And that's only meant to get to know each other, but it's foremost meant to get an idea of the culture of an organization. So they were very strong on the culture aspect and the informal aspect of the organization. And the structure itself of the organization was pretty informal. So basically at Hewlett Packard, they had a lot of different artifacts and practices and norms in terms of booklets and trainings, etc., which with the goal of having us implant the beliefs and values of HP into ourselves. And that's what many organizations have. So many organizations have training sessions when you start working in an organization, which are not only meant to get to learn the formal parts of the organization, but also to learn organizational culture. Well, there are many different ways of thinking of an organizational culture. So you have many typologies of an organization culture. And you can define culture in many ways, by its formality, by types of structure as well. Well, yeah, that's a very good point. So that bring that back. So it reminds me of churches and their different rituals and holy books. And there is not that much difference between certain organizations who are very, very strong on culture and religion. So it could be seen as a religion. So in HP, for example, it was almost religious, with training sessions at the beginning, regular meetings you had, the book you received when you started at the organization. So it was actually pretty similar. And churches is also it's a kind of a culture. So it's actually a pretty good comparison between religion and culture. It's not that different from each other. But if you start believing in what they said in those trainings, well, of course you think you're smarter than them, so you think, oh, now I know why you do this. So it's because you want to get to know the company, you want us to believe in HP norms and values. So you know it, but it still works, because it's just nice, It's just nice that you have a connection with all the people in your organization. It's just nice that you go to your work and thinking, oh, I really like working here instead of I only make money. So even though you know the reason for doing it, you still start to believe it's maybe a bit strong, but you still like it. You still identify to a certain part of the organization. And yeah, so it's also mere exposure. And also, so even in organizations where they don't have all that formal, more or less formal stuff at the beginning to instill a kind of culture on you, even then, of course, the longer you work in an organization, the more you develop a culture and a way of doing. And also within departments. So if you have a job, if you work at a supermarket or a part-time marketing agency, you already have certain ways of greeting each other when you come in the morning. And that also gives you a kind of sense of community and commitment to the organization. So again, it's very difficult to define exactly, oh, this is culture and this is structure and this is how we define culture in the organization. And HP was really, so they really wanted to, form a kind of a community. So they really had all those trainings and formal ways of learning culture. But in many organizations, it's way less formal, of course. So you just learn culture by being in the organization for a while. So culture is pretty important. So it needs to fit, of course, with the internal structure and the external environment. So if you cannot have a really strong political formal culture in your organization when you work in a very dynamic environment. If you have a very strict structure in your organization, your organization is very control-based. Certain cultures, you cannot really have an open, informal culture, of course. So there is a kind of an interaction between culture and structure, of course. Does corporate blindness count as part of a company's culture? I'm not sure what corporate blindness is. Could you explain that in one sentence? I finished the slide. So it turns out that organization culture is really important for employee behavior and satisfaction, and also indirectly for performance and innovation. So by colleagues and I do a lot of research into online identification with your organization. So are people willing to post things about your organization on Facebook or LinkedIn? And it turns out that there is a quite a large correlation between between the willingness of people to talk about your organization online and between satisfaction and commitment. So culture is really important because it can not only stimulate people to work for your organization, but also to be ambassadors of your organization, to post about your organization on Facebook, or to in general be positive to the outside world. Ah, yeah, that one. Yeah. It depends on how you define culture. So corporate blindness can be part of an organization culture, but it really depends. So in general, you see for example, in organizations like Google, they have a culture geared towards innovation. With the and every so how the organization is organized informally is so everything is in line with an innovative open culture. It's like the image in the middle, with all the hip things you see in swings in the organization and cozy corners where you can sit and relax. So though their culture is not really geared toward corporate blindness, but on the other hand, it can prevent you from seeing other things. So, and especially, for example, in more so organizations who have less to do with the environment, so who are more internally focused, they could be indeed blind to the outside. And I'll come back to that on the next slide, because I have a typology of of organization culture in which like one of the dimensions is could really spark corporate blindness. Now I think shell may be too big to define it as one. So I now pretend like there is a culture of an organization, but it's more likely that the culture of an organization is layered. So there is an overall culture of Tilburg University, it's understanding society and being open to society, etc. And we get part of that culture, but then we have faculties and we have departments and we have our teams that we work together with, and all contribute partly to the organization culture that I identify with. And I think it's similar for Shell. So we may tend to think that Shell really has corporate blindness and only wants to pump up more oil. But I don't know the inner workings of Shell, but I'm pretty convinced that they have departments within Shell who are more open to the environment. Well, not the environment like the environment, but the environment like the corporate environment. So I said that culture is layered. So you have national culture, you have corporate culture, you have subculture within departments, etc. So it's not from this is the culture of an organization. That's it. So this is the model by Quinn, and they use it as a kind of. And you can use this model in different ways. So it's used in the book by Body about management as a mental model that managers have about how they want to organize their work. But it's also a typology of organization culture, because basically a mental model that you have is basically the definition of culture. So this model is quite often used to classify organization cultures, but it's not the only one. So you can think of multiple dimensions of a culture. So, for example, the Hofstede dimensions like masculinity, femininity, and collectivism, etc. Those are also ways of structuring organization culture, and you can also classify an organization culture in terms of all those 5 dimensions of Hofstede. But this one by Quinn is often used in organizations. And it consists of 2 dimensions. So the one is flexibility versus control, and the other one is internal versus external focus. So flexibility versus control, so they're quite self-explanatory. Flexibility versus control is that on the one hand, you can have a culture that is really geared toward control, doing your work, having a lot of structure in place and everyone liking it, that they know what they have to do. On the other hand, you can have a culture that's more flexible, in which people like it, that they can plan their own work, in which they like uncertainty, or generally more flexible. The other dimension is internal versus externally focused. And that basically means, so do you have an eye for the environment of your organization? So do you like it with the people in your organization, and do you only look at them? Or do you have an eye to the outside and like input from the outside? And together that gives 4 different culture types, and those is what we're discussing next. So this is the picture that has been given in the chapter by Body, in which they also define the 4. So here are the 4 culture types, and there are a lot of aspects to that culture. So a rational goal is geared toward productivity. Human relations is geared toward commitment and morale. Pretty complicated. It's better to explain it based on this picture. Maybe I can. Sorry. So if you have an organization that is focused on the external environment, but is also focused on control. So in this picture, it's here, external and control. That's a rational goal organization. And that's an organization that's focused on efficiency in terms of external requirements. So so a typical example of a culture of an organization with this type of culture would be a fast-moving consumer good organization like Procter & Gamble on the slide here, or Unilever. Good question. Let me explain this first. I'll come back to it in a moment. Sorry. So these organizations, they have an eye for the outside. So they work in an environment with a lot of external contact, and they have a huge turnover, for example. So they need to have an eye for the environment. So they need to take their customers and the wider environment into account. But they're focused on efficiency. And that basically would mean that people in the organizations would be focused more on productivity, on competitiveness, and probably as a result, the internal workplace has an emphasis on efficiency, on winning, on winning in terms of making profit. Maybe there's also internal competition. How successful you are as an organization is defined in terms of market share, and that kind of shines off to the people who work there. So how successful they are may be defined in terms of how well they're doing in terms of making profit or increasing sales. So that is one way, one definition of, that's one dimension of culture. So rational goal. And of course, these kind of, so Originally, the model was developed as a way for managers to kind of think about, okay, how do I want to organize my work and my employees? Do I want to focus internally? Do I want to focus them on the external environment? So originally, it was created as a mental model for managers. But a mental model is basically the same as a culture. If it's shared between more than one person, then it's a culture. So then it was applied to organization culture. But of course, you're very right that this can also apply to other contexts. I do think, though, that the dimensions of culture here are pretty much organization function focused. So it's internal, external, control, flexibility. So it's probably most useful for organizations. It could also be useful for political organizations, political parties, or non-profit organizations, because they also deal with an environment, classified as flexibility and control. So for national cultures, or maybe for a culture between a group of friends, I think other dimensions may be more relevant, like collectivism, so the Hofstede dimensions may be more relevant. But it could indeed be applied to other contexts as well. So the second one is internal process. So that's focused on, that's here. That's focused on the internal environment and on control as well. So think McDonald's and production lines, some IT companies. They are really focused on internal efficiency and stability. And of course, every organization has an external environment, so it's never that they don't pay attention to the external environment at all. But they focus on it less, so they focus more on their internal structure. So think McDonald's, so they have a production line and a way of doing their work, which is very strict and focused. And that kind of is also how people are supposed to behave. So McDonald's has an employee of the month, so the one who did best that last month, which really nicely fits the internal process organization. So it's focused on internal efficiency and stability. Stability in terms, if you work for McDonald's, you get a McDonald's t-shirt, and they do everything to try to keep you part of the McDonald's clan, so to keep it relatively stable. So they also try to keep the culture under control as well. And HP, where I worked for, could also be classified, I think, mostly as well, it was kind of in between a more rational goal and an internal process, but it had internal process aspects. Because after all, where I worked for at HP was a call center. And a call center is just really formal with a lot of definitions and a lot of control and a lot of databases that you have to comply to. So when they build the culture around that. Anyway, an internal process culture is focused on internal control, on internal efficiency, on stability. You have a lot of routine and procedures, and the culture kind of applies to that. Also, a lot of rules and procedures in the culture. So kind of culture which is really kind of formally top-down given to you, like McDonald's does. And there's generally little autonomy to the organization. And as a result, sometimes there's also less culture, so there's less commitment and less satisfaction with the organization. So that's the second one, internal process. Yeah, what they generally try with an internal process organization, it's usually organizations in which work is not really fun. And so work has fun, that's a subjective term, in which work is rather structured and controlled. So you have not so much freedom to do work. And as a result, usually the turnover in those organizations is quite large. So the organizations try to kind of force a culture onto the employees. And some do better than others. So HP was very good at it. McDonald's also. Many people actually like working for McDonald's. Many people don't, of course. So they try to form a community with their employees, but still the community is not from, oh, let's have a nice community and everyone can tell or indicate what they want to do in the organization. No, it's a community which tries to be, nice and tries to create a culture, but not one that allows you to have control over your work. But indeed, if you have work that is very strict and formal, then kind of creating a community is a way to keep work more attractive for your employees. Yes, and it's absolutely right that different departments have different cultures. So McDonald's is quite standard, but if you work at headquarters or at the R&D development of McDonald's, trying to come up with new hamburgers, then it's highly likely that the culture is more an open system or more rational goal. Yeah, so it really can differ with departments. Good point, because that's what I wanted to say about Shell. I think Shell. So I think there work around 170,000 people or so for Shell. I think that organization is so big that a lot of people who work for Shell are really shielded off from the external environment, from the customers. So the organization is so big around them that they only deal in like 3 layers ahead with other people who work for Shell. And of course, that creates a separate culture. So if you work at an oil drilling platform, then you don't really deal with the external environment. So you don't really deal with stakeholders and with people from environmental organizations and with customers in general. So you only deal with other people on Shell, and that can kind of create a more internally focused culture. While I think that other parts of Shell, who work on, for example, work on solar energy, for example, they probably have a very different culture than other departments of Shell. So indeed, good point. I talk about organizations the whole time because that's just easier for me. And it can also apply to organization, but this can also indeed apply and be different for different departments. Okay. Open system. Open system is this one. This one. An open system is a culture which is flexible and is externally focused. Where are we here? So, I'll do this one first. So think Google, think startup, think marketing companies, think most of your organizations you came up with for your business plan, they probably will have a kind of an open systems culture because they have to be very flexible. They're usually smaller organizations. They are startups for which the external environment is really important. So these organizations have a kind of entrepreneurial culture. They are very flexible. Everyone can do their work as they see fit. It's pretty much decentralized because it's usually a smaller organization. It's very much focused on individuality and risk taking. So you can do your own work. You can work on your own projects. For example, like Google. So every employee, well, not everyone, but if you work at Google headquarters, 1 day a week, you have free time to work on whatever you like. So they do that to spur innovation. So this is an open systems culture. Finally, you have a human relations culture. Human relations is a culture that is flexible, but focused on the internal environment. And these organizations are usually what we call families. And they're called families because they don't have to worry that much about the external environment. So organizations will probably function anyways. So they work in a very stable environment, but they are still pretty flexible in how they handle work. And those are usually organizations. I think IKEA is an example, but also think insurance agencies, some governmental agencies. So like in general, organizations that are less sensitive to economic cycles, they can have a human relations culture or an internal process. But for human relations cultures, they pay very much attention to employee commitment and identification by allowing for flexibility. So teamwork is very important. Teams themselves can define how they do work. So it's always pretty informal, and there's a lot of coordination instead of control. So I said here, customers are seen as partners. Everything is geared toward teamwork and toward flexible teams. And there's usually a high degree of concern for people. So there's usually a good internal climate. So that's human relations. And if you take all that, so human relations is here, internal and flexibility. So there we are. Sorry for all the scrolling. So those are different ways of classifying culture. So that's one typology of culture. There are different ways as well, but I think this one is very useful to classify organizations. And it's very useful to think about a classification like this when you think about innovation in your organization. So because culture affects the attitude that people have towards innovation. So, for example, in a rational goal organization, which is geared towards control but focuses on the environment, they probably like innovation because it may make them more effective, more competitive. But because the organization is so control based and so individually based on performance, innovations that are more collective. Like, for example, if you have a knowledge management system in which you want to stimulate people to share what they know in a shared system, that probably won't work in an organization like that because it's so individually focused on performance. So people are probably less willing to share what they know with their colleagues because they consider colleagues also as competitors. While, for example, a knowledge sharing system or a social media system in general in an organization will work very well in a human relations culture because it's geared toward teamwork anyways. So culture affects your attitude towards innovation. So if you have information that belongs to you, if you have new information that can be turned into an innovation, for example, do you keep it to yourself or do you think it belongs to an organization? Can you use it for control or for creativity? So basically, should you hoard it? Should you keep the information with you? Or should you share it with others to use it as a source of innovation? So culture really affects if people are willing to share what they know. And sharing what you know is part of the innovation process. But also innovation in general. So do people see innovation as welcoming or are they resistant to innovation? So you can kind of imagine that organizations which are less flexible are less likely to adopt an innovation. So if people see innovations as useful, as part of their job, or if they welcome innovations or not, is also defined in part by the culture of an organization. So different cultures may stimulate innovation in different ways. So I will not go through everything here, but this is just examples of how they may stimulate innovation. So an open system is probably best geared toward more radical innovation because it's flexible, geared toward external innovation. So if you have a very new technology, at the start of the S cycle, at the start of the adoption curve, if it's a radical innovation, probably fits best with an open system. So if you have a more revolutionary innovation, so basically an innovation that's not for a new market and a new technology, but it's only for a new market, or maybe only for a new technology, that may fit better in a rational goal, because they probably are best in, okay, thinking about the market, thinking about which technologies fit which customers. Well, that's it. So internal process is probably, you don't want to innovate a lot with employees who have an internal process culture. So usually if the new systems, new innovations have to come very gradually, because people are geared towards control, and they are less flexible in the organization. Well, finally, human relations is focused more on the internal organization. So probably an innovation, a process innovation, so a change in the internal workings of an organization, would work well for these kinds of, within these kinds of cultures. But these are just mostly examples. So you just have to think about it. This could also be a very good exam question, to have a kind of a case and then to think about, okay, would this innovation fit with this type of culture, for example? So you have to think logically about, okay, what exactly is that culture, and how would innovation fit within that culture? Well, finally, I think most of you in your business plan will now think, okay, the culture of the organization we come up with in the second part of our business plan is probably open systems. And it most likely is, but please be careful to think about your type of innovation. So if you have an innovation which is really a new technology product, which results in a lot of, which has a production line, for example, and in which you need to be very aware that every technical component is made well, then maybe a rational goal is better as a culture. So for most of you in your business plan, open system probably kind of the way to go, but not always. So take that into account for your business plan. So, well, in summary, a culture can affect the technology and the systems that work best in your organization. So if you think of not only innovation, but think of the technology part of the innovation, and you can also logically argue that some technologies work better in certain types of culture than others. So if you have an organization which is really focused on control, and which is really focused on the internal organization, so in all rules and procedures, then probably huge integrated systems which kind of take control of everything in the organization, like ERP, which we talk about next week. Things like databases are probably best. So if you're a rational goal organization focused on the environment, but still very much focused on control, then you probably want a customer relationship management system. So you want to keep track of your customers, who they are, what they want, what they are doing. If you are a human relations culture, then you're very geared toward teamwork, then you probably want social media or other group communication technologies, etc. And it's also the other way around. So if you have a very open culture in your organization, but you suddenly implement an information technology and you force people to work with that technology, then probably culture may also change. Then probably culture may become less open, because people do now talk less to each other, but use the system more to type information into the system. So there's all kinds of interactions going on between culture and technology, between culture and innovation. The corporate culture of the Wolf of Wall Street. Oh God, let me remember it. It's been a long time since I saw that movie. Oh, let's see. my guess is that would be more of an open system kind of culture. So of course it has to be flexible. It's geared. It's focused on the outside world. You could say that it would be a rational goal because it's also because it's about making money, etc. But on that level, it's more, you need to be more flexible in terms of the deals you cut with your clients. So I think if you look at Leonardo DiCaprio's job and his department, it would be open systems. I'm pretty sure that many other departments who work for banks and other people who work in the stock exchange, it's more like an internal process organization because they basically only work with algorithms and they keep track of internal process and rational goals. So they have all those systems and all those algorithms to keep track of the markets, and they continuously work on improving those algorithms. So in general, companies who work with stocks, etc., I think would be rational goal internal process, but that higher end, that really high risk, high gain part, which is fun to watch, is probably open system. It's kind of, probably me, but I kind of like thinking about things like that, indeed. So that's a good question. So when you see a movie, then you can think about what would this be? How would that organization be structured? So how many people would work under that manager? What would the culture exactly be? So I think especially when I'm preparing for making an exam, I always think about those things when I watch television or when I watch a movie or so to come up with questions. So it can also help you to when you watch a series and you see an organization in the series you watch, to think about, okay, how is this structured? What is the culture? Helps you prepare for the exam. Okay, so next week, which means now, we will talk about people and technology and innovation. But I suggest we have like a short break of a couple of minutes. So let's start at 5 to 10, and then I'll come back to this. Yes, okay. So have a break, then I answer these questions in the meantime. For the project, we want to start on part E. However, this only starts at lecture 8. E is the systems. Yeah, well, you can you can check the literature, of course. You can wait until next week, but you can also think logically about what systems do you need. So, so if you want to probably keep track of your customers, so you probably want to have a system in which you have information about your customers. So you probably want to have a system for financial information. So you probably want to have a system in which you keep track of how many parts come into your organization. So you can start by thinking logically about, okay, what information do we need in the organization, and what kind of information technology do we need to store this information? So I think for part E, the thing we discussed last time about how a business process works, how information flows through an organization, is probably more useful for part E than the exact technologies. That we'll get to next. Yeah, the lecture about database assignments. Yeah, I promise I will do it this week. So I started this weekend, but I have really very much pain in my shoulder for the last couple of weeks, so I couldn't work too much in front of the computer last week because it just hurt too much. So I didn't have time to finish the presentation yet. So I'm sorry for that. It's a bit better now, but I just couldn't physically do it. Sorry. For the question in the discussion section, I removed the Bushians one because that was not a very useful paper to keep in the literature. So it's way better to just use common sense and what we discussed in the lecture just now. Innovation for which delivery is needed. Do you think it is necessary to include some or only mentioned in the flow? Now, I think if you just have delivery, so if you make a product and it needs to be delivered to a customer, that's something you don't need to extensively discuss in your business plan. That's just a very simple process. So just mention it. It needs to be delivered in an organization. It needs to go in from it's a flow, but you don't have to discuss that in detail. Only for the information flows and information systems in your business plan, focus on the 1 or 2 information flows and systems that are most relevant for your organization, because of course you will need dozens of those. You need a way to keep track of who works on your organization. You need to keep track of the payment for your employees, but those are not relevant. Okay, I'm going to get a cup of coffee and we'll continue. All right. Door. So, okay. So let's continue with the other lecture. So fortunately, I was talking about my shoulder pain, but since this weekend I have a desk that can go up and down automatically, which is really fun, and I have a good chair. So I hope everything will be better soon, and I'll then put the remaining lectures and lecture on databases online very quickly. So I'm sorry I didn't do that. It just, I needed like 8 ibuprofen to get through the day, so I'm sorry. Okay, for now. Let's continue with people, technology, and organization. So if you look at this lecture, there are a lot of hidden slides in the lecture. So I decided to skip those because of time issues and only focus on the most important parts of technology, innovation, and people. Basically, we have 2 theories that I want to discuss, of which one we already saw briefly when we talked about innovation, adoption of innovation. And I want to explain just also quite briefly one theory about human motivation. So we start with the technology acceptance models. So probably you have heard about technology acceptance models already. So if you took communication theory with me last year, I've talked about the theory of planned behavior, which is a way of thinking about, okay, how can you convince people of a certain argument used in advertising a lot. And maybe if you're a pre-master student, you also had the theory of planned behavior, of the theory of reason action before. And those are general theories who try to explain people's attitudes towards something and then people's intention and actual behavior. And all those theories have different factors that affect people's attitudes, but they're all basically the same. So you have certain beliefs about a certain thing. So, for example, the planned behavior, for example, you may have beliefs about smoking, smoking cessation, or alcohol use. Which defines your attitude, and that may define your intention to quit smoking or drink less. So that's used a lot in health advertising. But it all stems from, okay, you have certain beliefs, which is like cognitive, things you think are true or at least important to you. That leads to a certain attitude, a certain feeling of positive or negative about something. And that leads to behavior. So all those theories go from the cognitive side to the affective side to the behavior side. So cognitive in terms of beliefs, affective in terms of emotions and behaviors, and then behavioral in terms of intention and use. And theory of planned behavior and theory of reason action are based on the same theory. I forgot their names, but 2 people originally developed the theory of planned behavior. So that one was the first, and they then got into a fight and never saw each other again. This is seriously true, by the way. And then one of them continued and developed the theory of reason action, and the other one continued with the theory of planned behavior. So they're based on the same thing. The theory of reason action is used a lot in explaining how people use technology. So it's one of the most influential theories out there. But the basic theory of reasoned action is very simple. So it basically says if people consider a system to be useful and if people consider a system to be easy to use, then they have a positive attitude, an intention to use it, and they will actually use it. But that's, of course, too simple. So one of the criticisms on the theory is that, for example, imagine that you would say this to a manager or that you would advise this as a corporate consultant. So everyone would say, yeah, duh. So a lot of other models have been developed that try to specify, okay, what exactly is perceived usefulness and what is perceived ease of use. But the main addition of this model is that they said, okay, if you want to make sure that innovation is successful, if you want to make sure that people in an organization use a new technology or adopt a new innovation, then you will have to make sure that they not only think it is useful, but they also think it's easy to use. So you have to pay attention to both of these. So usefulness, that the system will enhance job performance. Useful, that the system users will be free of effort, perceived ease of use. Double slide. So this is what I also what I briefly explained in the lecture about technology adoption. So if you want the technology to be adopted, you need to take care of those two parts, and that goes for people who adopt your technology that you invented as an organization. But it's the same to convince people in your organization to adopt a new technology or an innovation. So one of the most extensive models that tries to specify what is perceived usefulness and perceived ease of use is the technology acceptance model, third version. And you see it's kind of a huge model with a lot of factors affecting ease of use and usefulness. But I do think it's pretty useful to explain and to at least know this model. And I also expect you for the exam, maybe not to remember all of them, but at least to remember some of the factors that lead to perceived usefulness and perceived ease of use. May seem difficult, but actually, if I explain them and if you then think about it logically, it is possible to derive the different factors without knowing them by heart. Why? Let's see some. First of all, if you think of perceived usefulness, there are basically two main components that make you think that the technology is useful. The first one is socially defined. So you can think that a technology is useful because of social reasons. And the social reasons, there's some experiences in there as well, but I'll explain that later on. One simple social reason is because other people use it too. That's subjective norm. So if you see other people using a system, you are more likely to use it as well. The second one is image. You think a technology is useful, and you use it because you think it's cool. Think your smartphone. You can also buy a cheap knockoff phone, work just as well, but you have an Apple or a Samsung. And you rationalize for yourself that you use it because it's very useful, but in reality, part of the reason you have the phone you have is because you see other people using it and because you think it fits your image. And those two are pretty important in defining perceived usefulness. Not only because of coolness reasons, of course, but also because if you see other people using it, you also learn how to use it and you learn the benefits. So it also adds to perceived usefulness. Moreover, if many people use a certain technology, you at a certain point have no choice in using and adopting the technology because everyone around you is also doing it. So you can be the last person without Snapchat, but in the end, everyone you know is on Snapchat, so you will be on Snapchat. Or I don't know, whatever you use right now, TikTok. I don't know. You have voluntariness and experience, which kind of moderating effects on the effects of subjective norm to intention to use. To be honest, that's not really important to remember. So, for example, experience. If you have more experience with using a certain system, it matters to you less what other people think. But to be honest, I would say only remember perceived useful, subjective norm and image, because those are the most important aspects. And they have direct influence on perceived usefulness. So those are social factors. Then we have cognitive factors, which affect perceived usefulness. So more like fact-based beliefs you have. And they are job relevance, output quality, and result demonstrability. Job relevance is basically, is the system relevant for your work, with the emphasis on your. So if you have a new system which may be very cool, this may be very useful to others, but it's not relevant to you, you will not consider it useful. That's a logical one. Then you have output quality. So a system can be very useful, but the thing that comes out of a system could be less useful. So you can have an information technology in an organization that you think, oh, this may be very useful, but the quality of the output is rubbish because there are a lot of errors in it, because people make a lot of errors when inputting information into the system. So the output is just rubbish. The output is rubbish, usefulness is also less. And finally, there's results demonstrability, and that's the most difficult one. That means that can you attribute any changes that you observe to the system or to something else? So, for example, new innovations or new technologies that are adopted in an organization, well, I'll come to that. Usually come with other changes as well. So, for example, you implement a new innovation in your organization, a new way of working, a new production line, a new database, whatever. And usually you also have changes in the way you have to work. So there are not only changes in technology, but also changes in structure and culture and processes, etc. And people can think, okay, yeah, I see that I now perform better, but it's not the system. It's just that because we do work differently. So result demonstrability is that you know that it is actually the technology that has caused the change and not other factors. Really, I hope that is clear now. So that's result demonstrability. So job relevance, is the system relevant to you? Output quality is what comes out of the system relevant? Result demonstrability, is it really the system or is it something else? And those 5 factors, subjective norm, image, job relevance, output quality, result demonstrability, together, of course, with perceived ease of use, determine usefulness. Because if you think something is easy to use, you also think it's more useful. Well, and of course, well, these are, it would be helpful if you remember those 5 for the exam, but you can also, just think logically about them. So if you think logically, okay, what would affect perceived usefulness? Okay, it's one part social, so it's kind of the image and what other people are doing, and it's one part the actual usefulness. So is it relevant for my work? Is what comes out of it relevant? So if you just remember, so those are things you can logically argue and logically think of. The only difficult one, I'd say, is result demonstrability. Okay, perceived ease of use. So in the first versions of the technology acceptance model, they did not really work out the factors affecting perceived ease of use. And this 3rd version of the model is the first one in which they tried to work out all the different factors affecting perceived ease of use. But arguably, this one these factors are less well defined than these ones. There are several that we know have been known for a long time affect ease of use, but several are still a bit vague. Yeah, so result, basically that's it. So result demonstrability relates to causation. So can you actually attribute any changes that you observe in your work to the innovation or technology, or is it something else? Yeah. So if you buy a new wardrobe, are any changes you observe in people looking at you and finding you attractive caused by the wardrobe, or caused by the fact that you have more self-esteem, something like that. Okay, so the 5 factors determining perceived ease of use are self-efficacy, external control, anxiety, playfulness, and enjoyment and usability design. And I don't expect you to remember all of them for the exam. The most important ones for perceived ease of use, I think, are self-efficacy, which basically is the belief you have that you can actually use the system. And this is what happens with older people and when you are confronted with a very new technology. So you think, I will never be able, so this is too complicated, too many buttons, too many changes. So you have a low self-efficacy, so a low belief in yourself that you can use the system. So upping people's self-esteem is pretty important if you want to convince people to use a new technology. And you do that by increasing external control. So by providing, and that basically means providing people with training and support so that they can use a new technology or innovation. You have anxiety and playfulness. Anxiety is related to self-efficacy, I'd say. So I would not consider it a separate factor if I would create a model like this. But anxiety is basically the degree that you fear. So it's related to your self-esteem, so the degree that you fear new technologies. Playfulness, I would consider playfulness part of enjoyment and usability. So it's the amount of fun built into the system. So is it fun to use the system? And that's related to layout and to like other general usability factors. So I would say that self-efficacy, external control, and usability aspects are the main factors that affect perceived ease of use. Is it the same model as in communication theory? Well, like I said, yes and no. The theory of planned behavior is the one we discussed in communication theory. It's a bit different, but it's also about attitude and intention and use. But this is being developed for technology to explain technology use. But the model is similar. It has the same origin. So regarding perceived ease of use, it's and regarding the model as a whole, so this technology acceptance model, third version, is the one that is most often used to explain technology use. So if you take all these factors into account, you can basically predict intention to use to 80% or so. So it's a pretty worthwhile model and a pretty powerful model. But there are many others. So you have many other models with many other different factors that affect perceived ease of use and perceived usefulness. But the distinction between usefulness and ease of use is, I think, is the most important. So, for example, like I said, there are many different models that explain that come up with different factors that affect perceived usefulness and perceived ease of use. So, if you remember lecture 4 about technology adoption, Rogers came up with 5 different factors that affect the adoption of a technology, which sort of relate to usability. So he came up with relative advantage, compatibility, complexity, triability, observability, and those can also be related to perceived usefulness and perceived ease of use. So this is the slide that I showed in lecture 4. And you can also tie those 5 factors by Rogers. You can also tie them to output quality and spelling error there, result demonstrability, etc. So there is relative advantage does the innovation have an advantage to what you are currently using? And that's of course related to output quality and result demonstrability, maybe also to job relevance. Compatibility of the system probably is related to usability and job relevance. Tryability, can you use the system beforehand, is related to training, etc. Well, you don't have to remember this, but you just have to see. It's just for you to see that there is a lot of overlap between the factors identified by Rogers and the ones that are in technology acceptance model 3. So this is not something to learn for the exam. Very good question. Good point. Sorry. It's not in there. Oh. It's not in there because usability. So, sorry. Good point. These 4 factors are related to your beliefs about the system. So it's basically your attitude. So your it's the training you receive. It's the self-esteem you have. So it's related to. So it's not related to the technology per se. So it's related to factors surrounding technology. So to your training you have, to your self-esteem, etc. So enjoyment and usability is basically the only factor. Well, maybe playfulness as well. But most of all, this one is the only factor that's a design factor. So enjoyment and usability, and I would also say playfulness, is the design factor in affecting perceived ease of use. And this may go a bit too far, but basically this is shifting the problem back because perceived ease of use is linked to usability and design, but then what affects good usability? And then you come into the terrain of human-computer interaction and all those minor aspects of a system that can affect usability, coloring, position on the screen, etc., which would take it way too far for our course. So that's why it's a separate circle. And you basically see that you also see that if it's that these more social factors like training and self-efficacy you have almost an equal impact on perceived ease of use than the exact layout of a system itself, which I think is quite interesting. That again, social factors are very important. Okay. So finally, for the technology acceptance model, you can have all kinds of, you can come up with all kinds of interplay between innovation adoption, and this model. I think Rogers, Rogers gave these 5 factors for which he doesn't really give an explanation, and there's not much empirical research to support these. But this has been investigated extensively, and it turns out that these factors are actually important in system use and also in adoption of an innovation. So I think technology acceptance model 3 offers a theoretical extension on the perceived product characteristic by Rogers. And you can also tie these factors to different stages in the adoption curve. So for example, for innovators, probably image of a technology plays a huge role. So you buy the new iPhone because you think it's cool, but also because you think it helps you. So because you think it's actually the technology that makes life better for you instead of other changes. So for innovators, they probably have a high degree of result demonstrability. They buy technology for image. They buy it for playfulness and enjoyment. So those factors are important to focus on when you introduce a new thing to the market. So focus on image, focus on result demonstrability, and on enjoyment and playfulness. For early adopters, then, they focus a bit more on the actual usefulness. So for them, they see the innovators doing it, so they start adopting a technology themselves. So for them, it's part subjective norm. But for them, job relevance and output quality. So is the system useful for my work? Does it deliver what I want it to deliver? Is important. But for early adopters, image as well. So if you go to the early majority and the late majority, for them, image doesn't really play into adopting the technology. So for them, for the early majority, and especially for the late majority, it's more about usability. So it must be easy to use. It's about training. So it's about learning and convincing people by giving them training into the innovation or the technology to convince them to use a system or an innovation. So for the early and late majority, things like usability, job relevance, training is more important. And finally, for the laggards and for the late majority, they probably are the ones who have low self-efficacy and who have anxiety. So you really have to take them by hand, and if you want those people to adopt innovation. So depending on the on where you are in the adoption curve for an innovation, and again, this goes for an innovation outside, but this also goes for a new innovation within your organization. So depending on where you are in the adoption curve and depending on who you want to convince of using a system, you can focus on different aspects of the model. So in the first instance, for the innovators, on image and playfulness, enjoyment, and for the later stages, focus on training and taking away anxiety, etc. So I think this model really ties in nicely with the whole innovation and adoption of innovation part of the course. So that's one. Then the last thing I want to do in the remaining 5, well, I'll take another 5 minutes after 10:30. I want to shortly explain how you can, what the interaction is between technology, innovation, and human motivation. And I will do this quite shortly because motivation is not a huge part of this course. I think we've all seen this. I forgot the name. You can help me with it. I forgot what the name of this pyramid is. But this is a theory of Maslow. Thanks, Maslow theory of innovation. Yeah, which says a motivation is hierarchical. So you first have a physiological motivation. You have to breathe, then you need to feel secure, and then finally you have self-actualization, in which you can be creative, etc. Which is largely true, but not always. You're a student, so you barely fulfills your physiological needs, but you're all focused on creativity and problem solving because you're students. So it's not always so hierarchical as Maslow means. But this is a useful typology of motivation. So he says, well, you have certain motivations which are hierarchically ordered, and you need to fulfill one motivation in one need in order to focus on the next one. And similarly, you also have motivations for doing your work. So you have intrinsic motivations, and intrinsic motivations are like really enjoying your work. So things that are part of, it's basically upside down for Western. But it's not necessarily due to Western culture. It's because in Western cultures, we are so used to, the first 2 or 3 phases being just generally there. We actually never have to worry about them usually. So we can focus on the upper parts. So that's why you learn it upside down. But it's just because we're spoiled. We've never been confronted with something we've never been confronted with lack of breathing, food, water, security, etc. So you have two types of motivation. You have, let me start with extrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation means you do your work because you get paid. So because you got punished, or because you think it's cool. So because you want to show to others what you're doing. So that's extrinsic. It's your motivation is outside. Intrinsic motivation is because you like doing it yourself, because you enjoy doing it, because you're satisfied with your work. And of course, as an organization, of course, you need a basic level of extrinsic motivation, but you want people to be intrinsically motivated. And this really ties in very tightly with organization culture, because if you have a strong culture in your organization, people will be committed and satisfied in your organization. So culture really adds to intrinsic motivation. I'm digressing. So what you want to do as an organization is stimulate intrinsic motivation. And basically, that means that you have a high internal motivation, that you do your work well, high performance, that you're satisfied, that you're not often sick, so low absenteeism and turnover. So basically, as an organization, you want this. Pointing is not used now. You want to achieve what's on the right side. In order to do so, I'll get back to that at the end of the lecture, about the promotion. So in order to do so, to attain that as an organization, you want your employees to experience meaningfulness. So to experience meaningfulness of work, to experience responsibility for their work, and to have knowledge of what you're doing. All of this don't have to remember for the exam. What is most important about motivation is that there is a model, the work motivation model, that has defined these 5 characteristics that are very relevant to stimulate motivation. And it's skill variety, task identity, task significance, autonomy, and feedback. Skill variety basically means that you can do multiple things. So your job does not only consist of one repetition you do all day, but you can do multiple things. So if you work on a production line, you're low skill variety. You as students have a high skill variety. You have to do a lot of things, try to pay attention to me for 1.5 hours, writing papers, studying for the exam. You have to do a lot. So you have a high skill variety. Task identity means that you know what you do your work for. So if you work for a production line, you may have no idea about what you actually do, it for. So, but if you know, okay, I do this part of the car, and this is a really necessary part of making the car, then you have a higher task identity. You know why you accomplish the task. So task identity is the idea that you do a complete operation, that you do something whole. And that's strongly related to task significance, which is the idea that what you do is meaningful, not only to yourself, but also to to the environment, to customers, to whatever you think is meaningful. So task identity is that you make something as part of a whole. Task significance is that that thing is also useful to the outside world. The next thing you need is autonomy. So the feeling that you can have some responsibility and some autonomy and control over your work. And the last thing is feedback. So knowledge, feedback about your performance and about what is done with your work. And the work motivation model says, well, these 5 things, these are important for finally motivating people. So the first 3 are important for experience meaningfulness, autonomy, affects experience responsibility, of course, feedback, knowledge of actual results. But basically, these 5 factors are core job dimensions that you need to pay attention to in order to affect people's motivation. Task significance is that what you do actually is meaningful so that you do something which benefits the customers of your organization or benefits other people in your organization or benefits the environment or whatever. So some meaningfulness of the work that you do. So that the task is useful to yourself and to others, so society, consumers, etc. So again, if you look at yourself, if you look at you as students, you should be very motivated because you have a large skill variety, you have a lot of autonomy, get feedback from me sometimes. The only thing that sometimes may lack is task significance. Why is this meaningful? And task identity. Why am I listening to Alex right now? Is this useful for my education as a whole? But if those 2 things are also in order, then you should be motivated for your study. So you as students have a high variety you're kind of high in all of these dimensions. So if you work at a production line, this is probably a bit lower. You may be less motivated. And what is quite interesting, and that's the last thing I'm going to say about this, because I think by far most important is thinking about these 5 aspects that affect motivation. But you can think of all kinds of ways that you can affect this. So for example, if you have people who work at a production line, you can give them feedback about why their work is important, about why the small thing that they're doing is actually very relevant for the final product, which gives them task identity and task significance. So you can think of different ways to stimulate these. So for example, you have organizations who work with a Twitter wall. So in which you, for example, in customer service, you usually have those huge screens in the office in which people can in real time see what people say about the organization. So the NS, National Railroad, has this in their customer service department. So they get immediate feedback from their customers. So which also can motivate people because they get more feedback. So you can think of all kinds of ways to stimulate that by using technology, for example, a Twitter wall, or by using other means, so by stimulating culture, by giving people more control, etc. So I think this model is pretty interesting to get people motivated, and it also ties in with, how you structure your organization, what the culture of an organization is, etc. So basically, that's the most important thing I wanted to say about this, about the work design model. And in the remaining slides, there are some examples of how you can stimulate those parts of motivation. But again, that's less important than these 5 factors. So that's it. Sorry for taking an additional 5 minutes from you. This week, I promise I will put these slides online for the database assignment. Next week, we will talk about information systems. And I think what I'm going to do next week. So next week, I have a part about the hard and the software. So it's really like a technical thing. I think I will record that as a separate online lecture. And I think next week in a lecture itself, I will focus on information systems. So on the major technologies that organizations use. For many of you who are not technologically inclined, this will be the most boring lecture. But promise, remember me, if you work in an exam, if you work in an organization later on, this will make perfect sense, and this will actually be very important. Well, I will repeat all of this next week, but for now, thank you very much, and I will see you next week. Good luck with your courses and good luck out for